All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Greiner, and I'm with Forget Computers, makers of Robot Cloud. And today's conversation, we're going to focus on Active Directory and Active Directory binding or not. And joining me today is Kevin White. Kevin, are you there?
I sure am, Ben.
Can you see
Thanks
my
for having me.
screen?
I sure can.
Okay, can you see your photo of yourself there?
Yes, I feel good about that.
Okay. So Kevin is working with us as under the special title of special advisor, and when he's not working on his latest book, what's the name of your latest book, Kevin?
It'll be support essentials for macOS Sierra.
Which will replace this one,
That's
or
right. Yep, that's the latest edition.
and that'll be out next week when you finish it.
Yeah, it's out. It'll be out this winter.
This winter,
There's a lot of
okay.
stuff
Well,
we have to work with Apple.
Sierra's been out for a week now, right? Maybe almost,
Yeah,
barely.
we usually wait until at least 1 point version though
Yeah,
before
and
we
I
start
try to tell all
getting
my
serious.
clients that as well. I'm not running it on my own machine. I won't be for a while, but we'll be testing it for sure. Okay, well, thanks for joining us, Kevin. I'll leave it sitting on your book there for now as we talk. One of the common requests that we get at Forget Computers, and especially through the Robot Cloud tool, is the desire to bind to Active Directory. And I always cringe a little bit when I get that request because I know that technically we can help people bind to Active Directory, but is that really a good thing? And Kevin, I remember a couple years ago when we were at Maxis Admin in Sweden together, and in fact, you're going to be speaking there in a couple weeks, right?
That's correct. Yep, I'll be actually doing the keynote this year.
Okay, great. Congratulations on that.
And there's why the book's delayed.
What's that?
And that's what I'm working on instead of the book this week.
Ah, okay, okay. Well, I remember you talked about how, Apple doesn't have a method for binding iOS devices, and that's kind of where we see things headed with Mac devices. That's a summary, but is that still something that's true?
I don't know if they're going to get rid of the functionality in OS 10. It's still there. It still
Hmm.
works when architected correctly. But I mean, iOS is essentially a non-multiple user operating system, so there's way too much that they would have to add to make it work right. And just it's an artifact of its time, Active Directory. It's an artifact of always connected computers
Hmm.
that don't go to sleep often and don't go on untrusted networks,
Hmm.
which of course is the opposite of iOS, right? iOS
Right.
devices are on all kinds of random networks that we don't trust necessarily, and obviously go to sleep and only have one user. So there's a lot of technical reasons why you wouldn't want to bind a mobile device, really.
Well, speaking of security, one of the most recently we had a request for binding to Active Directory, and I said, "Why? What's your business goal or need for doing that?" And the answer was, "We're getting dinged on security audits because we don't have our Macs bound to Active Directory." And I think that's a real misconception that simply by binding to Active Directory, you're getting any security benefits. What do you think about that?
Well, there are security policies that can be in place for users and passwords that can certainly help you from an Active Directory standpoint, but it's a fallacy to believe that just the act of being bound to Active Directory makes your Macs more secure. Active Directory from Apple's standpoint or from macOS 10, it really only provides identity services, which basically means username, password, and control of that password and control of access to network resources. And so it's true, Active Directory can provide that, but locally on the system, it doesn't actually give you any better security than what's already built in, or that can be managed with something like Robot Cloud. The big one that is typically talked about with Active Directory, of course, is identity, right? So I can make sure that they're using the account that I created for them in the domain and that they are following my password policies. And of course, we can get those things with other means. You
Right.
don't have to use Active Directory to get that same effect. It's just that in a lot of organizations, that is the methodology which they use.
Yeah.
And so that's what they're familiar with or what they think they have to use to get those effects.
And last year at the Jamf Nation User Conference, IBM came out and talked about how they use Casper Suite, which is what Robot Cloud is built on, to secure their Mac devices, and they do it all without Active Directory binding. Correct?
Yeah, that's correct. They do use directory services, identity services, and
Mm-hmm.
authentication services, and all that good stuff that you get from Active Directory. They just simply don't use that as the solution. They use
Right.
other things that provide similar functionality, but not from Microsoft, essentially. Because you have to realize that also IBM is not really partners with Microsoft. They're sort of competitors in a way.
Right.
And so it's a combination of, IBM's competing with Microsoft on a lot of levels, and also IBM's just too big for what Microsoft can provide. Believe it or not, there are customers who are even too big for what Microsoft can offer, and IBM's a great example of that.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about alternatives to binding, but before we do that, one of the other requests we get outside of the security reason for wanting to bind is management. The belief that, well, if we bind the Macs to Active Directory, then we can manage them. And I think that's a huge misconception because you're really, really limited in what you can do, right?
Yeah, in fact, I would argue that they don't actually provide any Mac management from a computer perspective. If you're familiar with Active Directory, you of course have this thing called group policy, and in group policy you can make all these rules that really isn't controlling the user so much as their computer, their Windows computer. None of that is used by the Mac. The Mac can't take advantage of any of that stuff.
Right.
Really the only thing it does for a Mac is provide, like I said, identity services, authentication services, and then that grants you access to things. But that's really not controlling the Mac at all. What you're really controlling is what the user has access to. So from a functional standpoint, Active Directory on the Mac really only provides you with access to things. It doesn't control the Mac experience really at all.
Exactly. And then the best way to really control and secure the Mac experience is through, we would say Robot Cloud, but there are other management tools out there. And in fact, we do have the ability within Robot Cloud to bind a machine to Active Directory through a policy. And we do execute that in some locations. So let me just talk briefly about why, even in a situation where Active Directory binding works and can be automated, why we don't like it. And in my experience, and I think you have some stories as well, Kevin, is it could work one day, but any network changes down the road could cause, login delays. We've talked about keychain issues with password changes. I think FileVault you mentioned can also play a part, and just frustrating the person using the machine, and there's no quick way to get around that other than unbinding in some cases.
Potentially, that's true. The big problem is when, essentially, long story short, the Mac gets out of sync with what Active Directory thinks is the truth. And the reason for that is the two big ones. macOS has two systems in it. One is called Keychain, the other one's called FileVault. Each have their own sort of password stores that are separate from the user account and technically separate from the directory as well. And the problem can happen is if you do any sort of password change outside of the Mac, those caches are now using the wrong password. And there's not, and in the case of FileVault and both Keychain, there's not a fix. I mean, there's not a true fix. In other words, there's not a fix that doesn't require you resetting something or you kind of erasing those secrets. You have to replace the Keychain password unless you know the old Keychain password. And on a FileVault Mac, it can be even more scary because you have the entire drives encrypted and you have to use some sort of recovery method to decrypt that drive. So in either case, Active Directory didn't just not help you, it made things worse.
I think that's at the end of the day, my concern is Active Directory binding, even if it works today, could really increase the calls to the support desk down the road. It always happens at the worst time.
Sure.
And typically it's because of a network change, or like you said, something gets out of sync. If it's a network change, it's most likely because the network team tested it with Windows and it passed with flying colors, and then they roll it out and the Macs all basically don't know what to do with the change.
Sure.
At that point, we're trying to figure out what did change, and it's a very time-consuming process. So there's now a potential solution to getting all the benefits of Active Directory binding without the bind. And this is a friend of yours, Joel Rennick, who I think everyone in the Mac community knows. In fact, you and I, Kevin, were working on a project recently where we're going to hopefully use Nomad. But can you explain a little bit about what this does?
Well, so again, the idea behind Active Directory is that you get identity, you get authentication, and you get authorization or access to things. And those can all be done without using the built-in bind mechanism in OS X through something like Nomad. In fact, going back to IBM, this is the grandchild of that process. Actually, this is an open source version of something similar to what IBM uses, which is to basically it's a local application that will identify your user on a Mac to Active Directory, and verify their account with authentication, and you get all the authentication controls that you get in Active Directory, like password expiry and mandatory password changes and things like that. And then you get the benefits of Active Directory, which of course are access to services like single sign-on and certificates. But instead of it being part of the OS, it's an application. It's just a local app.
Yeah, and I really like this approach because, as the tagline says, all the benefits of Active Directory without the bind. In my experience, it's the bind itself that can cause issues like the slow login, delayed logins.
Sure.
And if you're not bound, I don't know of any other reason that causes the login delays that we see sometimes with these Active Directory.
Let me give you an analogy. Think about your phone. Imagine if your phone relied on Active Directory and you couldn't unlock your phone unless it could talk to the domain controller. Your phone's completely useless until it talks to the domain controller.
Yeah.
And there's a reason we don't do that. Even if Facebook is down, you can still open up your phone.
Right. Right.
Or even if the domain's not working, you can still get to your phone. And that's the idea behind this. Even if Active Directory is not working, hey, at least I can still unlock my Mac with the local password, which again could have those controls from something like Robot Cloud. And then on top of that, if I happen to be on my network, I can use something like Nomad to get to my domain resources without having to essentially tie the unlocking of the Mac itself to Active Directory.
Yeah, so kudos to Joe Rennick for putting that out there. Really appreciate it, and hopefully we can give him some feedback to help continue to develop that solution. And I think we've covered all the topics that I wanted to cover when it comes to Active Directory. And I just want to reiterate that if you've been told, you being an IT administrator in your organization, that you need to bind to Active Directory, I really, when it comes to Mac, I really want you to question that and consider using tools like Robot Cloud to basically get everything that you need from a security standpoint and a management standpoint without jumping straight to binding, because binding really works well on the Windows platform, but not so well on the Mac side. And yes, it can be done and it can work, but it's kind of a pain in the backside. Is that fair to say, Kevin? I'm not overreaching my complaint, am I?
I'll give you sort of the opposite. Here's the one place where Active Directory does work really, really well. Lab environment. When you have a lab of Macs, like in a college, and they don't go anywhere, and they sit on the same network all year round, and you want to have more than one person logging in, Active Directory is without question the best solution for that. But when you have laptops that are essentially owned by individual people, or there's only one person who uses it all day long, which is actually most environments now. Most work environments, everybody gets their own computer. So it doesn't really make sense to have that ability to log in multiple users. It's actually less secure to use Active Directory in that environment. But on the flip side, like I said, the one place where I do see it useful, computer labs. Otherwise, there are better solutions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, well, great. Kevin, I appreciate your time, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll talk to you next month.